It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
The day before the gala, the Sterling estate smelled of cloying Casablanca lilies and desperate ambition. 24 hours remained until Bianca Sterling's Influencer of the Year celebration, and the foyer had been transformed into a staging ground for a war Sloane was the only one who knew was coming. Sloane stood at the edge of the marble staircase, watching the chaos below. Bianca was in the center of the room, her voice a sharp, grating frequency that cut through the frantic energy of the event planners. She was wearing a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, a shimmering gold piece that caught the morning light with offensive brilliance. "Not there!" Bianca screamed, pointing an acrylic-tipped finger at a floral arrangement. "The lighting in that corner is trash. If the centerpieces don't pop on a 4K stream, I'm not paying for them." Lydia Sterling hovered nearby, adjusting the collar of Bianca's dress with a look of worshipful intensity. She didn't even look up when Sloane descended the stairs. To her mother, Sloane was merely a shadow, a utility that provided the background hum of the family's lifestyle without needing to be seen. "Sloane, thank God," Bianca snapped, finally noticing her sister. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she thrust a heavy, velvet-lined box toward her. "The insurance for the necklace Julian got me hasn't cleared. I need you to wire the deposit to the courier. Now, I can't go on stage wearing last season's scraps." Sloane took the box, the weight of the jewelry inside feeling like lead. "Julian Vane bought this?" she asked, her voice level. "With what money, Bianca? His last 3 ventures are currently under federal investigation." Bianca's eyes flashed with a familiar, entitled rage. "He's a visionary. Something you wouldn't understand while you're staring at code in your dark little hole. Just pay the fee. You've got the emergency fund Dad set up for the house. Use that. That fund is for property taxes, Bianca, not for Julian's attempts to look like a mogul," Sloane replied. "Just do it." Bianca stepped closer, the oversweet scent of her vanilla perfume filling the space between them. "Do you have any idea how much work I've put into this? This gala is my coronation. Tomorrow night, the Sterling name becomes a global brand. You're just the help, Sloane. Don't forget who the star of this family is." Sloane felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. Instead, she reached into her pocket and felt the cool, brushed metal of her encrypted phone. Marcus Vane had sent a final confirmation 10 minutes ago. The back doors are open. The financial mirrors are set. 1 click and the projection changes. "I'll handle the deposit," Sloane said quietly. "But are you sure you want to go through with this? Once the spotlight is on you tomorrow, there's no hiding. Everything you've built, everything you've earned, will be on full display." Bianca let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She turned to Lydia, who was nodding in agreement. "Did you hear that, Mom? Sloane's worried about me. She's actually jealous enough to try and psych me out." "Don't be bitter, Sloane," Lydia said, her voice dripping with dismissive pity. "It's not Bianca's fault she was born for the light and you were born for the shadows. Go handle the wire. And try to find something to wear tomorrow that doesn't make you look like a librarian. We have an image to maintain." Sloane turned away, the sound of her own heels clicking against the marble sounding like a countdown. She retreated to the library, where the air was cooler and smelled of old paper and woodwax. Arthur Sterling was there, hunched over a mahogany desk, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. He looked up as she entered, his expression darkening. "Sloane, good. I need your signature on these digital affidavits for the Sterling Group," Arthur said, not even waiting for her to sit. "The new loan for Bianca's studio expansion requires a family guarantee." Sloane walked to the desk, her eyes scanning the documents. "You're using my personal credit as a secondary collateral again, Dad, without asking." Arthur slammed his hand onto the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "I am the head of this family. I've spent 30 years building this name so you could live in luxury. If I need to move some numbers around to ensure your sister's success, you will comply. You're a Sterling. Act like it." "I'm acting like a Sterling," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, clinical whisper. She leaned over the desk, her shadow falling across the documents. I'm looking at a paper trail that leads directly to fraud, Dad. I'd check the validity of those signatures if I were you. Sometimes when you build a house of cards, the wind comes from inside the room. Arthur sneered, waving her off. You always were too smart for your own good. Just sign the damn forms and get out. I have a gala to prepare for. Sloane didn't sign. She simply turned and walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused. I'll see you tomorrow night, Dad. I think it's going to be a very illuminating evening for everyone. She didn't wait for his response. She made her way to the secluded corner of the garden, pulling out her phone. The screen displayed a countdown, 22:14:05. She hit a speed dial. Marcus answered on the first ring. Is the evidence package for the board ready? Sloane asked. Uploaded and encrypted, Marcus replied, his voice a steady anchor. The moment Bianca starts her keynote, the influencer of the year will find out exactly what happens when you steal from a lion while it's sleeping. Are you ready? Sloane looked back at the house, where the lights were blazing and the sounds of entitled laughter drifted through the open windows. She felt the weight of the years of humiliation, the wine stains, the dismissals, and the theft. It all condensed into a single, cold point of clarity. I've been ready for 5 years, Marcus, she said. Let them have their party. It's the last one they'll ever be able to afford. She hung up, watching the sun begin to set over the estate. Tomorrow, the Sterling name wouldn't be a brand. It would be a warning. And as the first stars began to appear, Sloane realized she wasn't just waiting for justice. She was the one delivering it. The following morning, the Sterling estate smelled of expensive Arabica beans and the cloying, synthetic vanilla of Bianca's favorite perfume. Sloane sat at the marble kitchen island, her movements precise as she stirred a single drop of cream into her coffee. She didn't look up when the frantic tapping of designer heels echoed against the limestone floors, signaling her sister's arrival. Sloane, move. You're literally blocking the natural light, Bianca snapped, shoving a ring light into position. She didn't wait for a response before propping her phone against a vase of imported lilies. I'm filming my authentic morning segment for the followers, and your depressed energy is killing the vibe. Go sit in the laundry room or something. Sloane took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. The liquid was scalding, but she didn't flinch. She watched through the reflection in her black mug as Bianca fluffed her hair and practiced a pout that was as manufactured as her follower count. Arthur stepped into the room, the heavy tread of his handmade loafers announcing his authority before he even spoke. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, his gaze sweeping over Sloane with the weary disappointment he had perfected over the last decade. He didn't offer a greeting. I saw the architectural blueprints on your desk this morning, Sloane, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that low, commanding register he used to intimidate subordinates. Bianca is using the layout for her wellness sanctuary pitch at the Influencer of the Year Gala tomorrow night. I've already had my assistant rebrand the files under her name. Sloane felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but her face remained a mask of clinical indifference. Those designs took me 18 months to finalize, Father. They're proprietary to my firm. Your firm? Arthur let out a short, mocking bark of laughter. Everything in this house belongs to the Sterling name, and right now, that name needs Bianca to win this award to secure the Vane partnership. You're a backroom technician, Sloane. You don't have the social capital to do anything with those designs. Let your sister have the win. It's for the good of the family. Lydia drifted into the kitchen then, draped in silk and smelling of gin and expensive moisturizer. She patted Sloane's hand, though her eyes were fixed on Bianca's camera setup. Be a dear and don't be difficult, Sloane. And while you're being helpful, I need you to transfer the funds for Bianca's gala gown alterations. Her accounts are temporarily illiquid due to her recent brand investments. Investments? Sloane asked quietly. Is that what we're calling Julian's gambling debts now? Across the table, Julian Vane looked up from his phone, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He looked hungover, the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap bourbon clinging to his designer sweatshirt. He was the liability Sloane had been tracking for months, The felon, her sister, was determined to marry into the family. "Watch your mouth, sis," Julian said, his voice raspy. "I'm going to be your brother-in-law soon. Maybe once Bianca is influencer of the year, she'll be generous enough to buy you a personality, or at least a dress that didn't come from a clearance rack." Bianca giggled, hitting the record button on her phone. "Okay, everyone, quiet, I'm starting. Hi, guys. Welcome to a morning in my life as a CEO and visionary." Sloane stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. None of them looked at her. To them, she was a ghost, a convenient source of income and labor that existed only to facilitate their delusions. She walked toward the hallway, her hand brushing against the pocket of her cardigan. Inside, the small, encrypted device Marcus had given her vibrated twice. A silent confirmation. She reached her study and locked the door. On her monitor, a series of windows began to populate with data. Marcus had successfully bypassed the security on Julian's burner phone. Sloane watched as a string of text messages appeared, conversations between Julian and a known identity thief, discussing the liquidation of Sterling family assets that Arthur didn't even know were missing yet. She scrolled further, finding the hidden folder Bianca thought was deleted. It contained the raw, unedited footage of Bianca mocking her poor followers, calling them disposable sheep, while she laughed about faking her charity donations. Sloane's finger hovered over the upload key. Not yet. The gala was in 24 hours. The stage was being set, the witnesses were being invited, and the Sterling name was about to be burned into the public consciousness in a way her father had never imagined. She looked out the window at the manicured lawn, the silver spoon in her hand reflecting the cold, sharp light of the morning. They thought she was a servant in her own home. They thought she was a sleeping lion. They were about to find out that she had been awake the entire time. And she was very, very hungry. 3 hours after the sun had climbed over the manicured hedges of the estate, Sloane Sterling stood in a room that smelled of cold ozone and high-voltage static. This was Marcus Vane's domain, a windowless industrial loft where the only light came from the rhythmic blinking of server racks. The low hum of cooling fans provided a mechanical heartbeat to the space, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of her father's mansion. Marcus didn't look up from his monitors. He was a man of few words and expensive tastes in encryption, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard with a sound like hailstones on a tin roof. He tapped a final key and slid a matte black USB drive across the scarred metal desk. It looked like a common piece of plastic, but to Sloane, it felt like a detonator. "The Trojan is live," Marcus said, his voice a low gravel. "I've mapped the gala's internal AV network. The moment you plug this into any terminal on the Sterling server, it'll bypass their firewalls and give me remote override. I can push any feed I want to the main ballroom screens." Sloane picked up the drive. The metal casing was cold against her palm, a tactile reminder of the clinical precision she required. "And the financial backtrail." "It's all there," he replied, finally meeting her gaze. Every penny Bianca raised for the children's hospital was diverted into a shell company registered to Julian Vane. "I tracked the crypto tumblers. Your sister wasn't just faking her influencer lifestyle. She was laundering the donations to pay off Julian's gambling debts in Macau." Sloane felt a surge of cold satisfaction. It wasn't just about the mockery anymore. This was systemic fraud, a house of cards built on the goodwill of thousands. She tucked the drive into the hidden lining of her blazer. "You're sure the override is undetectable? To their IT staff, absolutely. They're used to fixing printer jams and resetting passwords for your father. They won't see me coming until the video is already looping for the donors." Sloane nodded, her mind already calibrating the next 18 hours. She left the loft without another word, the city air tasting of salt and exhaust as she drove back toward the gilded cage of the Sterling estate. By the time she reached the mansion, the atmosphere had shifted from frantic to toxic. In the grand dining room, Arthur Sterling was presiding over a mountain of seating charts and floral samples. He looked up as Sloane entered, his face darkening with the familiar expression of a man looking at a bad investment. "Where have you been?" Arthur demanded, the heavy signet ring on his finger cracking against the mahogany table. "The caterers are demanding a secondary deposit, and the Sterling Foundation account is flagged for a security audit. I told you to handle the digital side of the business, not disappear for the afternoon." "I was securing the network for tomorrow night, Father," Sloane said, her voice a flat, calm line. Bianca Sterling lounged in a velvet armchair nearby, her eyes glued to her phone as a stylist hovered over her, adjusting a strand of platinum hair. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, let her be, Dad. Sloane probably had to go buy a new personality to wear for the gala. God knows the one she has now is depressing." "Don't be cruel, Bea," Lydia Sterling chirped from the corner, though her eyes never left the fabric swatches for the table runners. "Sloane, dear, your father is right. We're short $200,000 for the final gala expenses. Since you're so fond of your little cybersecurity salary, you can cover the shortfall. It's for a good cause, after all." The audacity of the request hung in the air like a thick, cloying perfume. They were asking her to fund the very event where they intended to parade their stolen virtue, using the money she had earned through years of silent, grueling work to cover the holes Julian and Bianca had dug in the family coffers. Sloane looked at Julian Vane, who was leaning against the sideboard, sipping a vintage scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He smirked at her, a predator who thought he'd already won. He didn't know that Marcus had spent the morning tracing his digital fingerprints across 3 continents. "200,000, Sloane repeated, her tone unreadable. "Consider it your ticket to the head table," Arthur snapped, turning back to his charts. "Otherwise, you can spend the evening in the kitchen with the rest of the help. You've always been more comfortable in the shadows anyway." Sloane felt the weight of the USB drive against her ribs. She could feel the rage of 1,000 dismissals coalescing into a singular, sharp point of focus. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out her checkbook. "I'll cover it," she said. Bianca looked up, a glimmer of greedy triumph in her eyes. "See, I knew you were good for something, sis. Just make sure the transfer clears by morning. I need the gala to be perfect. It's my big night." "It's going to be a night no one ever forgets, Bianca," Sloane said, her voice dropping an octave. She walked toward the stairs, leaving them to their champagne and their lies. As she reached the landing, she paused, looking down at the tableau of her family, the aggressor, the enabler, and the thief. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the Trojan horse she had just walked through their front door. She entered her bedroom and locked the door. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. She pulled out her laptop, the screen's blue light reflecting in her steady eyes. One final sync with Marcus, one final check of the gala's program. The main presentation was scheduled for 9:00 p.m. Bianca's Vision of Hope speech. Sloane leaned back, her fingers hovering over the keys. The stage was set, the witnesses were bought and paid for, and the Sterling family was about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room is the one they never bothered to truly see. 18 hours. She began to type, her movements as rhythmic and cold as the servers in the loft. The countdown had reached the point of no return. The day before the gala, the Sterling estate was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. The air in the foyer was thick with the cloying, powdery scent of lilies, Lydia's favorite for public displays of mourning or celebration, and the sharp, metallic tang of industrial steamers. Sloane stood on the second-floor landing, her hand resting lightly on the polished mahogany railing, watching the chaos below. A small army of caterers and decorators moved with practiced urgency, transforming the ballroom into a sanctuary of hope, the theme Bianca had chosen for her latest rebrand. She felt a presence behind her before she heard the footsteps. Lydia approached, the silk of her robe whispering against the floorboards. Her mother didn't look at her. Her eyes were fixed on the florist below, who was currently arranging a massive centerpiece of white roses. "The lighting technicians are demanding an extra $3,000 for the livestream rig," Lydia said, her voice tight with a familiar, manipulative edge. They say the bandwidth requirements for Bianca's followers are higher than quoted. Your father is already overextended with the venue deposit, Sloane. We need you to cover the gap. Sloane didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, sleek edge of the encrypted drive Marcus had delivered an hour ago. Of course, Mother. I'll transfer the funds within the hour. Lydia finally turned, offering a thin, fleeting smile that never reached her eyes. You've always been the reliable one. It's a shame you don't have your sister's spark, but at least you're useful. Useful, Sloane repeated, the word tasting like iron. I'll remember that. She moved past her mother and headed toward the kitchen, where the scent of bitter espresso cut through the floral haze. Bianca was there, perched on a bar stool like a queen on a temporary throne. She was draped in a designer wrap, her phone held aloft as she filmed a teaser for her Vision of Hope's speech. Julian Vane sat beside her, his eyes darting toward the door as Sloane entered. He looked pale, the nervous energy of a man who knew his past was a ticking clock. And remember, guys, Bianca chirped into the camera, her voice a saccharine melody of manufactured sincerity. Hope isn't just a feeling, it's a legacy. She tapped the screen, ending the recording, and the mask immediately dropped. Sloane, you're in my shot. Move. I was just looking for a coffee, Sloane said, her voice deceptively mild. She walked to the counter, pouring a cup of the dark, steaming liquid. The heat of the ceramic warmed her palms. I heard your speech outline, Bianca. It's quite ambitious. You're talking a lot about transparency this year. Bianca let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Transparency sells, Sloane. People want to feel like they're seeing the real me. Not that you'd understand anything about branding. Oh, I think I understand it better than you realize, Sloane replied, taking a slow sip of the coffee. She leaned against the counter, her gaze shifting to Julian, who was pointedly avoiding her eyes. You should be careful with the high-definition feed tonight, though. With that much light, even the smallest cracks in the foundation tend to show up on screen. Bianca's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine irritation breaking through her arrogance. What is that supposed to mean? Just a warning. When you build a house of cards, you shouldn't invite a gale force wind to the party. Is that a threat? Arthur Sterling's voice boomed from the doorway. He stepped into the room, his presence heavy and suffocating. He placed a hand on Bianca's shoulder, a gesture of protection that felt more like an endorsement of her theft. Don't listen to her, Bianca. She's just bitter because she's spent her life in a cubicle while you're about to become the face of this family's future. He turned his cold, gray eyes toward Sloane. If you can't be supportive, stay in your room until the guests arrive. I won't have you ruining this for her with your pathetic jealousy. Do you understand? Sloane set her coffee cup down on the marble island with a soft, deliberate click. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the kitchen. She looked at her father, then at the sister who had spent years bleeding her dry, and finally at the man who was helping them do it. I understand perfectly, Father, she said, her voice a low, clinical hum. I'll be out of your way. I have a few final preparations of my own to attend to. She walked out of the room, her footsteps steady and silent on the plush carpet. As she climbed the stairs, she felt Julian's gaze lingering on her back, a look of dawning, frantic realization. He was the only one who saw the lack of fear in her eyes, and it was clearly beginning to terrify him. Back in her room, Sloane locked the door and sat at her desk. She opened the laptop, the blue light reflecting in her pupils like a digital storm. She tapped a single key, bringing up the gala's main server. Marcus, she whispered into the headset. The enablers have doubled down. They've even started charging me for the privilege of their betrayal. Let them, Marcus's voice crackled back, steady and cold. The more they take now, the more they'll owe when the sun goes down tomorrow. Everything is synced. The moment she starts that speech, the truth goes live to every device in the building. Sloane leaned back, her eyes fixed on the countdown timer she had set. 14 hours. The Sterling family was so busy admiring the stage they had built that they hadn't noticed the floorboards were already rotting beneath their feet. She closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Tomorrow, the Vision of Hope would become a spectacle of ruin, and for the first time in her life, Sloane Sterling wasn't just watching the fire. She was the match. The evening of the Sterling Foundation's Vision of Hope gala arrived with a suffocating sense of opulence. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was a sea of silk, tuxedos, and the heavy, cloying scent of lilies that fought against the sharp aroma of expensive floor wax. Sloane Sterling stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers grazing the cold marble railing. She wore a dress of midnight blue silk that moved like liquid shadow, a stark contrast to the blinding whites and golds favored by the rest of her family. Down on the main floor, Bianca Sterling was already holding court. She looked like a gilded bird of prey in a gown encrusted with enough sequins to blind a photographer. Beside her, Julian Vane stood with a practiced, smug grin, his hand resting possessively on her waist. To the casual observer, they were the golden couple of the social season. To Sloane, they were two parasites who had finally run out of hosts. "There you are!" A sharp, familiar voice cut through the hum of the string quartet. Sloane didn't turn. She knew the cadence of her mother's disappointment. Lydia Sterling stepped up beside her, the smell of her vintage perfume preceding her like a warning. She adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet that Sloane had paid for 3 Christmases ago. "You look presentable," Lydia said, her eyes scanning Sloane's dress with a critical squint. "But you really should have worn the Chanel I picked out. This looks a bit too much like you're attending a funeral." "Maybe I am," Sloane replied, her voice level. Lydia scoffed, waving a manicured hand. "Don't be dramatic. Your father is an estate. He's worried you'll make a scene about the administrative fees he moved from your account. Honestly, Sloane, it's for the foundation. It's for hope. Try to be a team player for once tonight." Sloane finally looked at her. Her mother didn't see a daughter. She saw a ledger that had finally stopped balancing in her favor. "I'll be exactly what the family needs me to be tonight, Mother." Lydia patted her cheek, a gesture that felt more like a slap. "Good girl. Now go down there and smile. Bianca is about to do an interview with the social columnists, and it would look better if you were standing behind her." Sloane watched her mother flutter away toward the champagne tower. She reached into her clutch, her thumb brushing the smooth, matte surface of a small black device Marcus Vane had delivered an hour before the doors opened. It was the master override for the ballroom's integrated media system. The Vision of Hope was about to get a very different perspective. As she descended the grand staircase, the sound of her heels on the marble was a steady, rhythmic pulse. She reached the floor just as Bianca was finishing a laugh for a group of local philanthropists. "Oh, look," Bianca chirped, her voice rising an octave for the benefit of her audience. She turned to Sloane, her smile not reaching her eyes. "My big sister finally decided to join the party. Sloane, honey, could you be a dear? Julian's glass is empty and the servers are so busy. You don't mind, do you?" Bianca held out a crystal flute, dripping with condensation. The circle of guests went quiet, their eyes darting between the two sisters. It was a calculated move, a public reminder of Sloane's perceived status as the family's errand girl. Sloane didn't take the glass. She simply looked at it, then up at Bianca. "I think you've had enough to drink tonight, Bianca. You'll want a clear head for your speech." Bianca's face flushed beneath her heavy foundation. Her eyes flashed with a sudden ugly heat. "Don't you dare try to mother me. You're here because we allowed you to be here. Now take the glass before I make things very uncomfortable for you." Julian stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "You heard her, Sloane. Don't ruin the night with your usual gloom. Just help out and keep your mouth shut." The arrogance in his voice was a physical weight. Sloane felt a flicker of the old rage, but she suppressed it, replacing it with the cold, clinical precision she used to deconstruct a firewall. She leaned in closer to Bianca, her voice a whisper that only the two of them could hear. "Enjoy the spotlight while it's still on you," Sloane said. "It's a long way down from that stage." Bianca let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You're pathetic. You have nothing. No one. By tomorrow morning, even your name will belong to me." She shoved the empty glass into Sloane's hand and turned back to the guests, her expression flipping instantly back to influencer perfect. Sloane stood there for a moment, the glass cold in her hand, watching her sister bask in the unearned adoration of a room full of enablers. A few yards away, Arthur Sterling was deep in conversation with a group of investors. He looked triumphant, his chest swelling as he gestured toward the massive LED screen at the front of the room. He spotted Sloane and beckoned her over with a sharp, commanding flick of his wrist. "Sloane," Arthur said, his voice booming with fake heartiness. "I was just telling these gentlemen about the legacy gift you're finalizing tonight, a significant contribution to the Sterling expansion project." The investors looked at her with expectant, greedy smiles. Arthur's hand landed on her shoulder, his grip tightening in a silent warning. He was selling her assets in real time, right in front of her face. "The legacy is definitely being finalized tonight, Arthur," Sloane said, using his first name with a deliberate, icy clarity. Arthur's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "It's father to you, especially in company. We'll talk about your attitude later. Right now, the program is starting. Go find your seat at the back table." He dismissed her with a turn of his shoulder, already moving on to his next mark. Sloane didn't go to the back. She moved toward the shadows near the tech booth. She felt the vibration of her phone in her silk clutch. A single text from Marcus, all systems green. "The trap is set. Give the word." Sloane looked up at the stage. Bianca was already moving toward the podium, adjusting the microphone with a flourish. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, and a hush fell over the 300 guests. The air felt electric, charged with the impending collapse of a dynasty. Bianca tapped the mic, the sound echoing through the hall like a gavel. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice radiating a false, honeyed warmth. "Tonight isn't just about charity. It's about the truth of what it means to be a Sterling." Sloane's thumb found the button on the override device. She felt a strange, calm sense of justice settle over her. "Yes," she whispered to the empty air. "Let's talk about the truth." She pressed the button. On the massive screen behind Bianca, the Vision of Hope logo flickered once, then vanished, replaced by a black screen and a glowing white countdown timer. 10 seconds. Sloane stepped out from the shadows, her eyes fixed on Bianca's unsuspecting back. The siege had begun. The countdown hit 0 with a silent, heavy finality. The Vision of Hope logo didn't just disappear. It was incinerated by a flood of raw data. Spreadsheets, wire transfer receipts, and high-resolution photos of Julian Vane's multiple passports flickered across the 60-foot screen. The ballroom, once filled with the polite clinking of silverware and the hum of high society gossip, became a tomb of absolute silence. Sloane Sterling stepped further into the light, her heels clicking against the polished marble like a metronome. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at the stage. Bianca Sterling stood frozen, the microphone still gripped in her hand, her shadow cast long and distorted over the evidence of her own greed. The smell of expensive lilies in the room suddenly felt cloying, like funeral incense, mixing with the faint scent of ozone from the overheated projector. Arthur Sterling's face turned a shade of bruised purple, his hand tightening around his crystal flute until the stems snapped, splashing gold liquid across his tuxedo. Beside him, Lydia Sterling's mouth hung open, her fingers twitching at the pearls around her neck as if they were suddenly choking her. Across the room, Julian Vane's eyes darted toward the service exits, his swagger replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped animal. Mrs. Gable, the gala's largest donor, set her glass down with a sharp, echoing clack on a marble pedestal, her expression shifting from confusion to cold, sharp fury. Bianca's face underwent a grotesque transformation, the carefully applied porcelain foundation cracking as her features melted. Her eyes, once sharp with predatory triumph, stretched into hollow orbs of white-trimmed terror. The honeyed tan of her cheeks drained away, leaving a sickly gray pallor that made her look decades older in the harsh glow of the projector. Her jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, her lips trembling as they tried to form a lie that her brain could no longer construct. Every muscle in her neck corded with the strain of a silent scream, her regal posture collapsing into a jagged, trembling ruin of a woman. She looked at the screen, then at the crowd, her breath coming in ragged, audible gasps that the microphone picked up and broadcasted to the entire room like the wheezing of a dying engine. Sloane reached the edge of the stage. She didn't climb the stairs. She didn't need to. The power had already shifted, flowing away from the podium and pooling at her feet. She watched a specific slide click into place. The raw data Marcus Vane had extracted from the encrypted servers, showing a recorded conversation between Bianca and Julian, the audio ripples dancing in neon green across the black background. "You said tonight was about the truth of what it means to be a Sterling," Sloane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the vacuum of the ballroom, it carried like a thunderclap. She met her sister's hollow gaze with a look of clinical detachment. "I decided to help you tell it. Every cent of the Vision of Hope fund didn't go to the children. It went to Julian's offshore accounts to pay off his gambling debts. The Sterling name isn't a legacy, Bianca. It's a crime scene." Bianca tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped her throat. She looked toward Arthur, her eyes pleading for a rescue that wasn't coming. Her father was too busy staring at the screen, watching his own digital signature authorize the fraudulent transfers. The betrayal was total, documented, and irreversible. The socialites in the front row began to pull their chairs back, creating a physical gap between themselves and the woman who had, moments ago, been their golden girl. Sloane felt the override device hum in her palm one last time before she slipped it into her clutch. She had spent years being the invisible bank, the silent architect of their comfort, and the scapegoat for their failures. Watching the social fabric of their lives tear apart in real time provided a cold, sharp satisfaction that tasted better than any vintage in the room. "Enjoy the rest of the evening," she said, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the elite who had spent the last hour whispering about her lack of status. "The authorities are already in the lobby. I've given them the master key." She turned on her heel and walked toward the main doors. She didn't look back to see the first journalist raise a camera or to hear the first scream of accusation from a donor. She simply walked out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling dynasty behind her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from Marcus confirming the police were moving in. The siege wasn't just over, the fortress had fallen. 10 minutes had passed since Sloane Sterling stepped into the cool, shadowed foyer of the ballroom, but the heat of the scandal behind her still felt like a physical weight. She stood near the towering glass exits, her silhouette sharp against the marble. Outside, the rhythmic strobe of blue and red lights painted the pavement, a silent herald of the collapse she had engineered. Inside the hall, the music had died, replaced by the frantic, overlapping sounds of a social vacuum being filled by reality. Sloane watched as the double doors swung open, and the first of the Sterling inner circle was forced out. Bianca Sterling didn't walk. She stumbled, her silver stilettos catching on the carpet as 2 officers guided her toward the processing area in the lobby. Her carefully contoured features didn't just drop, they seemed to dissolve in real time. The frantic twitch in her left eyelid broke the illusion of the unbothered queen she sold to her millions of followers. Her skin, usually glowing with expensive primers, turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the heavy rouge on her cheekbones look like bruises. Her mouth hung open, a silent, jagged O that leaked the remains of her composure, while her eyes darted around the room, searching for a camera lens that wasn't documenting her disgrace. "Sloane," Bianca shrieked, her voice cracking. Tell them this is a mistake. You're the one who handles the accounts. You did this." Sloane didn't move. She didn't even blink. She simply watched her sister, noting the way the sequins on Bianca's gown caught the police lights, shimmering like a dying fish. Behind her, Arthur Sterling was being led out in silence. The man who had built a dynasty on the backs of others looked suddenly, jarringly old. His tailored tuxedo jacket was bunched at the shoulders where an officer held him, and his face was a mask of frozen, impotent fury. When he saw Sloane, he tried to lung forward, but the restraint was absolute. "I gave you everything," he hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl of betrayal. "You gave me a bill for a life I never asked for, Arthur," she replied, her voice clinical and devoid of the heat he wanted. "And then you tried to make me pay it twice. The forensic audit is already in the hands of the district attorney. Every offshore transfer, every loan from the foundation to Bianca's failing brand, it's all there. Signed by you." Lydia Sterling followed them, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't keep her clutch purse closed. It fell to the floor, spilling expensive lipsticks and a gold-plated pill case across the marble. She looked at Sloane with a watery, manipulative desperation. "Sloane, darling, think of the family. We can fix this. We can tell them Julian was the one." "Julian Vane is already in custody, Lydia," a new voice cut in. Marcus Vane stepped out from the security alcove, his tablet glowing with a finality that made Lydia flinch. He started talking the moment the zip ties went on. He's not interested in being the fall guy for a family that's already underwater. The flip was instantaneous and brutal. Mrs. Gable, the matriarch of the city's oldest charitable fund, stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers. She had spent the last 3 years praising Bianca's visionary spirit. Now she looked at the younger woman with a revulsion so pure it was almost elegant. "To think we allowed you into our homes," Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying across the hushed lobby. "You didn't just steal from your sister. You stole from every charity this family pretended to support." A chorus of agreement rippled through the witnesses. A prominent journalist, who had been on Bianca's payroll for positive coverage, was already typing furiously on her phone, her face set in a look of professional detachment as she drafted the exposé of the decade. The influencers who had been Bianca's best friends an hour ago were now huddled in a corner, their phones raised not to help her, but to livestream the arrest to their own audiences, capitalizing on the carcass of her reputation. "You're nothing without us," Bianca screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as she was led toward the patrol car. "You'll be alone, Sloane. You hear me? Alone." Sloane watched as the doors of the vehicle slammed shut, muffling the sound of her sister's hysterics. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant crackle of police radios. Lydia reached out one last time, her fingers grazing Sloane's sleeve. "Please, just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I'm your mother." Sloane gently unhooked her mother's hand, the touch as cold as the marble beneath them. "A mother protects. You recruited. There's a difference." She turned to Marcus, who was watching the final patrol car pull away. The lobby was beginning to clear as the elite fled the scene of the social carnage, desperate to distance themselves from the Sterling name. "Is the system purge complete?" Sloane asked. Marcus nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "The accounts are frozen. The property liens are being filed as we speak. By tomorrow morning, the only thing left of the Sterling estate will be the debt they tried to bury you under." Sloane looked out at the night sky. The air was crisp, smelling of rain and ozone. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest, the weight of 5 years of strategic patience finally dissipating. She had dismantled the fortress, brick by brick, and left the architects of her misery standing in the rubble. She didn't stay to watch the janitorial staff begin the long process of cleaning the ballroom. She didn't wait for the lawyers to call. Sloane simply walked toward her own car, parked far from the flashing lights. As she pulled away, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a decade, she didn't look like a Sterling. She looked like herself. Her phone buzzed in the center console. A notification from a news app flashed. Sterling dynasty toppled. Fraud, betrayal, and the anonymous architect behind the fall. Sloane reached out and turned the phone off. The silence in the car was the most expensive thing she had ever owned, and she intended to enjoy every second of it. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling name became a punchline in the financial journals. Sloane sat in her new office on the 42nd floor, where the floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of a city that no longer felt like a cage. The air here was different. It didn't carry the suffocating scent of Lydia's lilies or the stale cigar smoke that had always clung to Arthur's study. Instead, it smelled of ozone, polished steel, and the rich, dark aroma of fresh espresso. She watched a notification blink on her primary monitor. It was an encrypted ping from Marcus Vane. He didn't call unless the perimeter was breached, or unless he had something she needed to see. Sloane tapped a key, and a series of grainy images filled the screen. They were a far cry from the high-fashion spreads Bianca used to post. In the photos, a woman stood outside a cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights hummed with a flickering, sickly yellow. She was wearing a coat that had seen better days, her once perfect hair matted and hidden under a cheap beanie. She was carrying a bag of groceries that looked heavy, her shoulders hunched as she fumbled with a rusted lock. "She tried to sell another exclusive to the tabloids this morning," Marcus said, his voice coming through the speakers with a dry, professional edge. "A tell-all about your cruelty." The editor at the Daily Insider laughed her out of the building. Apparently, nobody wants to buy a story from a woman who's currently being investigated for 3 different counts of identity theft. Sloane leaned back in her ergonomic chair, the leather cool against her skin. She felt a flicker of the old rage, but it was distant now, like a storm receding over the horizon. "And the others?" "Arthur is still navigating the pretrial motions," Marcus replied. "His lawyers are bleeding him dry. He tried to list the summer house, but since you technically own the land it sits on through the holding company, the sale was blocked. He's living in a motel near the courthouse. Lydia." "Well, Lydia is Lydia. She's been sending letters to your old address. I have them in a secure file if you want to read them." "I don't," Sloane said. She knew what they contained. A mixture of guilt-tripping and demands for maintenance money, as if she were still the family's private ATM. She closed the window with the photos of her sister. The face slap from the ballroom had been the sharp, sudden shock, but this, the slow, grinding reality of their new lives, was the true consequence. They had spent decades building a fortress of arrogance on a foundation of her labor. Now that the foundation was gone, they were discovering just how little they were worth to the world without her. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a restricted number. Sloane hesitated, then swiped to listen. It was a voicemail left 10 minutes ago. Sloane, I know you're listening." Bianca's voice crackled, high-pitched and frantic. The entitlement was still there, buried under layers of desperation. "You think you've won? I'm eating canned soup in a room that smells like bleach. Julian is in jail because of those files you leaked. You ruined us. Dad is sick, Sloane. He's actually sick this time. If you have any soul left, you'll call the lawyers and drop the land claim. We're family. You can't just leave us like this." Sloane deleted the message before it finished. The sick routine was a classic Arthur move, a play for sympathy they had used a dozen times to get her to sign documents she shouldn't have. The silence that followed the deletion was the most expensive thing she had ever earned. It was a silence that cost her a family, a decade of her life, and the version of herself that still believed in blood loyalty. She stood up and walked to the window. Below, the city was a grid of light and motion. She was thriving. Her firm was the most sought-after security collective in the tri-state area, and her personal accounts were shielded by layers of encryption even she would have trouble cracking. She had won. The architects of her misery were standing in the rubble of their own making, and she was finally, legally, and emotionally, a ghost to them. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw the cost. Her eyes were harder than they had been 5 years ago. There was a coldness in the set of her jaw that hadn't been there before the betrayals. She had dismantled the Sterling dynasty, but she had become a person who knew exactly how to destroy a life. She picked up her espresso, the ceramic warm in her hand. On her desk sat a single framed photo, not of the Sterlings, but of the small, quiet house she had bought by the coast, a place where no one knew her name. The perimeter was secure. The threats were neutralized. Sloane took a sip of the bitter coffee and turned her back on the view, walking toward the door. She had a life to live, and for the first time she didn't have to ask anyone for permission to start it.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.